Alexander the Great, 356 to 323 BC. Chapter 1. The Birth of a Lion, 356 to 343 BC. The night was heavy with omens. In the city of Pella, the beating heart of the Macedonian kingdom, torches flickered in the humid air, casting long shadows against marble walls. A great silence had settled across the palace, broken only by hurried footsteps and whispered prayers. Inside her chamber, Queen Olympias labored, her cries echoing against the stones. Somewhere in the distance, thunder rumbled across the hills. And then, at the stroke of midnight, a cry pierced the night. A boy was born. It was the year 356 BC. Few could have guessed that this child, squirming in the arms of his mother, would one day bring empires to their knees. Yet even in that moment, stories began to spread. That very night, Philip, king of Macedon, and father to the newborn, received word that his army had won a great victory against the Illyrians. Messengers told of lightning striking the heavens, of a temple of Artemis burning in far-off Ephesus, the goddess too distracted, some said, by the arrival of a boy destined to shake the world. Olympias, the queen, was no ordinary woman. Fierce and passionate, she traced her lineage back to the kings of Epirus. A devoted worshipper of the god Dionysus, she was known to walk barefoot into sacred rites, surrounded by serpents, her eyes blazing with divine fervor. To her, this child was more than a son. He was touched by the gods themselves. She whispered into his tiny ears that he was descended from Achilles, the hero of Troy, and that greatness was not merely his destiny, it was his duty. Philip, meanwhile, was a king hardened by war. He had transformed Macedonia from a fragile, fractured kingdom into a rising power. He was a man of vision, strategy, and ruthless ambition. To him, the boy was not merely a child, but an heir to a dream, a unified Greece, and perhaps more. The boy was named Alexander. From the beginning, his life was anything but ordinary. He grew up in the bustling palace of Pella, surrounded by marble halls, courtyards filled with statues, and the constant rhythm of soldiers drilling in the fields beyond the walls. The young prince was restless, full of energy, quick to anger, but quicker to learn. Stories say that even as a child, he was fascinated by heroes and gods. He begged his tutors to recount the tales of Homer, the wrath of Achilles, the cunning of Odysseus, the fall of Troy. He listened wide-eyed, fists clenched, as though he himself had been there upon the plains of Ilium. But he was not just a dreamer of myths. From an early age, he trained with sword and spear, ran with the royal pages, and learned the discipline of the Macedonian phalanx. His father demanded toughness, his mother demanded greatness, and between the two, Alexander grew into something sharper than either had imagined. One story, preserved through the centuries, captures the fire of the young prince. When Alexander was around 12, a Thessalian brought a magnificent stallion to the court. The horse was enormous, jet black, its muscles rippling with power. But it was wild. No man could ride it. Each attempt ended in chaos. The beast bucked, kicked, and reared, nearly killing its would-be riders. King Philip was ready to dismiss the animal, but young Alexander stepped forward. "I will ride him," he declared. Laughter rippled through the court. The boy was small compared to the beast, barely a youth, but Alexander was undeterred. He had been watching carefully, and he had noticed something the others had not. The horse was terrified of its own shadow. Slowly, with patience beyond his years, Alexander approached. He turned the stallion toward the sun, so that the shadows fell behind. He spoke gently, stroked its mane, and then, in a moment that stunned all present, he mounted. The stallion bucked, surged, and thundered across the field, but Alexander held firm, guiding it with steady hands. Within moments, the wild horse obeyed, galloping under the boy as though they were one. The court erupted in shouts of amazement. King Philip, tears in his eyes, embraced his son. "My boy," he said, "Macedonia is too small for you. You must seek a kingdom greater than this." The horse was named Bucephalus, and he would carry Alexander across continents, through countless battles, until the very edge of the known world. But Alexander's path was not shaped by his father alone. Olympias, his mother, held his heart and mind in a grip of iron. She filled him with tales of his divine ancestry, whispering that Zeus himself had fathered him. She instilled in him a belief not only in destiny, but in immortality, that he was chosen, not merely born. The bond between Alexander and Olympias was deep, fierce, and unbreakable. Yet it also sowed seeds of conflict. Philip's other wives, other children, and other ambitions created rivalries in the court. Alexander, caught between his father's worldly pragmatism and his mother's fiery visions, learned early how to navigate treachery, jealousy, and ambition. It was a childhood of contradictions, tenderness and brutality, love and rivalry, myth and reality. And it forged in Alexander a will as unyielding as steel. By the time he reached his early teens, he had already shown signs of brilliance. He debated philosophy with his tutors, led hunting parties that rivaled the exploits of seasoned men, and displayed a courage that inspired both admiration and fear. But Philip, ever calculating, knew his son needed more than courage. He needed wisdom. He needed guidance from a mind as sharp as his own ambitions. And so, Philip sought out one of the greatest teachers the world had ever known, Aristotle. The stage was set. The boy who would conquer the world was about to meet the philosopher who would shape his mind. The omens had spoken, the gods had whispered, and the world had begun to tremble. For Alexander of Macedon was no ordinary child. He was the storm to come. Chapter 2. The Philosopher's Pupil, 343 to 336 BC. The boy who would be king was growing restless. By the time Alexander reached 13, his brilliance was already clear to all who saw him. He could outpace his peers in training, outthink them in debate, and he absorbed stories of gods and heroes as though they were written for him alone. But Philip knew that raw talent was not enough. Greatness required discipline, wisdom, and philosophy. And so he summoned one of the greatest minds the world had ever produced, Aristotle of Stagira. The philosopher arrived in Macedonia like a man stepping from another world. He had studied in Athens, in the hallowed halls of Plato's academy, where questions of truth and justice, politics and science were debated beneath the shade of olive trees. Now he came north to mold the mind of a prince who was destined to shape the destiny of nations. Philip built him a sanctuary of learning at Mysa, a grove far from the bustle of the court. It was here, beneath rustling leaves and in marble colonnades, that Alexander and his companions gathered to be taught. Aristotle's lessons were not those of an ordinary tutor. He spoke of the structure of the universe, of the movements of stars and the nature of the soul. He introduced Alexander to biology, medicine, ethics,
and the subtleties of persuasion. He taught him that knowledge was not mere words, but power, the kind of power that could rule men's hearts as surely as the sword. Alexander listened with an intensity that few could match. He was no passive student. He argued, he questioned, he demanded answers. Aristotle, for his part, recognized in the boy a mind aflame.
Yet one book towered above all others in Alexander's heart, Homer's Iliad. Aristotle gave him a special annotated copy, and from that moment the young prince carried it everywhere, sleeping with it beneath his pillow. To Alexander, Achilles was not just a hero of the past, he was a model for the future. He dreamed of fighting his own Trojan War, of carving his own immortal name into the memory of mankind. The fire of Homer's verses fed his ambition until it burned hotter than the sun. Still, Alexander was no mere dreamer of legends. He loved the sciences. He dissected animals with Aristotle, learning the secrets of their anatomy. He studied the nature of rivers and winds, the habits of foreign peoples, the mechanics of siege weapons. His mind reached out across the known world long before his body would follow. He began to imagine himself not only as a warrior, but as a bridge between nations, a ruler who could unite East and West beneath one vision. But the lessons of Mieza were not confined to scrolls and speech. Alexander and his companions, young men who would one day command armies beside him, hunted in the forests, trained in formation, and debated in the halls until their voices were hoarse. Among them were Ptolemy, Hephaestion, and Cassander, names that would one day be etched into history, friends who would become either his greatest allies or his bitterest rivals. In those youthful years, bonds of loyalty and envy alike were forged, bonds that would shape the fate of an empire. Aristotle, though, was not merely a teacher of ideas, he was a man of convictions, a believer in hierarchy, in the natural order of rulers and ruled. He instilled in Alexander a sense that some men were born to command and others to obey. He taught him the art of rhetoric, the delicate power of words to bend men's will. He warned him of the excesses of tyranny, even as he encouraged the pursuit of glory. Alexander absorbed it all, but always with his own interpretation, for he was not a vessel to be filled, he was a storm to be guided.
Meanwhile, the world outside Mieza was shifting. Philip was expanding his power with relentless force, marching his armies across Greece, forcing city after city into his growing league. Battles raged, treaties were signed and broken, enemies humbled or crushed. The boy in the grove could hear the echo of war on the wind, and it stirred his blood. He longed to ride with the men, to wield spear and shield in his father's campaigns, to test the lessons of Aristotle against the brutal truths of battle. The moment came sooner than anyone expected. At 16, while Philip was away campaigning, Alexander was left as a regent of Macedonia. It was a test, and he rose to it like a lion. The Maedi, a Thracian tribe, rose in rebellion. Alexander did not hesitate. He gathered the Macedonian army, led them north, crushed the uprising, and founded a city on the conquered land. He named it Alexandropolis, his first city, built in his name, a symbol of what was to come. From that moment on, no one doubted him. He was not merely a boy, he was a commander, and his star was rising. Yet life in the court of Pella was never free of shadows. Philip's victories abroad only sharpened the rivalries at home. Olympias, fiercely protective of her son, watched as other wives and other heirs circled like wolves. She whispered to Alexander that he must be ready, that destiny was a fragile thing, easily stolen if not guarded with steel. The young prince began to see plots in every corner, betrayal in every smile.
He trusted few outside his closest circle, and even among friends, he remained cautious. His relationship with Philip was equally complex. He admired his father's brilliance as a general, respected his vision as a statesman, but he could never forgive his infidelities, nor the way he sometimes dismissed him as a mere boy. Pride and love wrestled in Alexander's heart, and the struggle would shape his path for years to come. Still, the boy's education was complete. He had mastered the words of philosophers, the strategies of generals, the myths of heroes, and the discipline of soldiers. He was ready to step onto the stage of history, and history in turn was ready for him. As the sun set over the hills of Macedonia, Alexander looked eastward, his eyes burning with the fire of unspoken dreams. He was no longer just the son of Philip, no longer just the pupil of Aristotle. He was Alexander, and the world would soon know his name.
Chapter 3. The Throne of Blood, 336 BC. The winds of Macedonia carried whispers of betrayal and blood. King Philip, Alexander's father, had conquered Greece, forged alliances, and brought the fractured city-states under his iron hand. He was a man who knew the price of power, a strategist unmatched, a king who had shaped the very bones of an empire. Yet even as he planned his next campaigns, plotting to march east against Persia, fate conspired to strike where he was most vulnerable. It was a warm day in Aigi, the royal city, during a wedding feast of celebration. Laughter echoed through the marble halls, wine flowed like rivers, and courtiers whispered gossip behind gilded columns. In the midst of the revelry, a shadow moved, silent and deliberate. A bodyguard, once trusted, unsheathed a dagger, and in a single, brutal instant, Philip II fell, cut down before his court. The king's lifeblood soaked the floor, and the hall erupted into chaos. Screams, confusion, the clatter of falling goblets. A kingdom trembled on the edge of an abyss. Alexander was just 20 years old. In that moment, a boy became a man. He arrived at the scene of horror with eyes blazing, his mind racing faster than grief or fear. There was no time for mourning. Macedonia teetered on the brink of collapse, rivals circling like vultures, the Greek cities restless, and enemies abroad waiting to exploit weakness. If he hesitated, his father's legacy and his own claim would vanish. Alexander acted with cold precision. He seized the throne, not as a boy claiming inheritance, but as a lion asserting dominion. In a kingdom forged by blood and steel, hesitation was death. His first acts were ruthless, swift, and shocking. Those who challenged him, nobles who doubted his youth or plotted rebellion, were crushed. At the city of Thebes, defiance stirred. The proud Greeks had long resisted Macedonian rule, and some saw Philip's death as a chance to reclaim freedom. Alexander would allow no such illusions. He marched upon Thebes with his army, his eyes burning with a fire that knew no mercy. The siege was swift, merciless, and absolute. Alexander's men tore through the city, walls shattered under catapults, homes and temples consumed in flames. Soldiers moved with the precision of a predator, sparing few, taking what they must, leaving terror as a warning to others. Thebes fell into ruin, the survivors scattered or enslaved, and the rest of Greece understood a simple truth: Alexander's reign would not be questioned. His father's shadow had ended, but the young king's light would burn brighter, fiercer, and far more dangerous. With Greece subdued, Alexander's mind turned eastward. Persia, the vast empire that stretched from the sands of Egypt to the mountains of India, awaited. Its riches, its power, its armies dwarfing any he had yet faced.
But Alexander was no longer a boy playing at conquest. He was a king armed with ambition, strategy, and an unshakable belief in his destiny. Yet even as he plotted, Alexander bore the weight of loss. Philip's death was more than a political pivot, it was a personal scar. Memories of his father's lessons, the fire of their debates, the complex love and rivalry that had shaped his youth haunted him. Grief mingled with resolve, forging a man who would act decisively, often with the merciless clarity of someone who knew life and power could be taken in an instant. The court of Macedonia was restless. Allies had to be reassured, generals had to be commanded, revolts quelled. Alexander moved like a storm, decisive, fearless, and unrelenting. In every council, in every battlefield maneuver, he proved that youth was no weakness. He was a king who demanded obedience, who inspired loyalty through courage and fear alike.
And yet, even amid triumph, he remained a learner, a strategist who would study the battlefield as Aristotle had taught him to study the mind, always seeking the advantage, always thinking several steps ahead. By the time he set his eyes fully upon Persia, Alexander was no longer merely the son of Philip or the pupil of Aristotle. He was a force in his own right, a man who carried the blood of gods and heroes, a young king who could reshape the world with the edge of a sword and the fire of his mind. In the shadow of his father's death, Alexander's destiny began to unfold. The throne of Macedonia was not merely inherited, it was seized, earned in blood, cemented in fear and respect. The stage was set for the greatest campaign the world had ever seen. A young king, untested by age but tempered by grief, ambition, and cunning, would soon march eastward, carrying the weight of a kingdom, the memory of a father, and the fire of a world yet to be conquered. And so, Alexander took the throne, not as a boy stepping into a father's shoes, but as a lion claiming the world, roaring in defiance, and signaling that the era of Alexander the Great had begun.
Chapter 4. The Crossing, 334 BC. The dawn over the Hellespont was cold and crisp, the sea mist rising like smoke from a battlefield yet to be fought. Alexander stood at the prow of a ship, the wind whipping through his hair, eyes fixed on the opposite shore. 40,000 men followed him, a legion of Macedonians hardened by years of training and the unyielding discipline of their king. The narrow strait separated Europe from Asia, but to Alexander it was not a mere channel of water. It was the boundary between the familiar and the realm of destiny. With one decisive step, he would cross not only land, but history itself. Before setting foot on Asia, Alexander paused at the ruins of Troy. The city, ancient and broken, had seen heroes rise and fall, legends written in blood and fire. Here, at the tomb of Achilles, he knelt. The wind carried whispers of the past, and in the silence he swore to the gods, to the heroes of old, and to himself, that he would surpass them all. His destiny was not to emulate, but to eclipse, to carve his name across the continents in a blaze of glory that would never fade. The crossing itself was swift, but tense. Soldiers lined the ships, shields gleaming, spears bristling, the smell of salt and sweat mingling in the morning air. The Hellespont churned beneath them, waves threatening to capsize the small vessels, but Alexander's resolve was unshakable. When he finally set foot on the Asian shore, he plunged his spear into the soil, declaring Asia his by right of conquest. The men behind him cheered, their voices echoing across the water, a roar that carried the promise of battles, victories, and kingdoms yet to fall.
The first confrontation awaited almost immediately at the river Granicus. Persian satraps had gathered their forces, confident in numbers and position.
The river itself was a barrier, its waters swollen and treacherous, but Alexander saw opportunity in its challenge. He urged his men forward, urging them to charge through the rushing water, the enemy waiting on the far bank. Spears splintered, shields shattered, and the battle erupted into chaos. Alexander, riding Bucephalus at the front of the charge, was nearly struck down by a Persian cavalryman. Only the swift intervention of his companions saved him, but he pressed on, unyielding, inspiring his men to greater ferocity. By nightfall, the Persian forces lay scattered and broken. Their commanders had been slain or driven into retreat. Asia Minor was open to Macedonia. Alexander, soaked with river water and blood, surveyed the battlefield. It was a first step, but a monumental one. He had not only crossed a physical boundary, he had crossed the threshold into legend. Every soldier, every commander, every messenger who would later speak of this day would call it the beginning of a new world, Alexander's world. Yet the young king's mind was already moving ahead. The victory at Granicus was but a taste of what was to come. He knew Persia's heart lay farther east, in vast cities and armies far greater than those he had faced. But Alexander believed not in the limits of men, but in the power of destiny. Numbers, terrain, and caution were subordinate to courage, intelligence, and the unshakable conviction that he was chosen to rule.
Behind the battlefield, the Macedonian armies celebrated. Fires burned along the riverbanks, toasts were made to victory, and songs of heroes old and new echoed in the night. Alexander, however, remained apart, staring toward the east. The mountains in the distance promised more battles, more challenges, more glory. He understood that victory was not merely a moment, but a journey, and that the path ahead would be bloodied, treacherous, and unrelenting. And yet there was exhilaration in the risk, a clarity in danger. Alexander had crossed into Asia not as a conqueror of land, but as a harbinger of history. Each step forward would reshape kingdoms, topple empires, and carve a trail of legend in his wake. From the riverbanks of Granicus, he envisioned the cities he would storm, the kings he would challenge, and the empire he would build. This was only the beginning. With the wind at his back and destiny in his grasp, Alexander led his army onward, ever eastward, into the heart of the Persian Empire, into the pages of legend, and into the hearts of men who would tell his story for centuries. The crossing of the Hellespont was not simply a maneuver of war. It was a declaration to the world that Alexander of Macedon had arrived, and nothing, neither river, nor army, nor king, could stop him.
Chapter 5. Lord of Asia, 333 BC. The sun blazed over the plains of Asia Minor, turning the earth to dust and fire. Alexander had crossed into the heart of Persia, but conquest was only beginning. City after city lay in his path. Some surrendered at his approach, dazzled by the legend of the young king who rode with fury and wisdom. Others resisted, fortified and proud, certain that Persia's shadow could never be toppled. Alexander pressed on relentlessly, driven by a vision that reached far beyond the horizon, beyond the known world itself. In the city of Gordium, he confronted a challenge both legendary and symbolic. The Gordian knot, a tangle of ropes said to be impossible to untie, bound a chariot pole in the temple of a forgotten king. It was said that whoever could unravel it would rule all of Asia. Alexander approached, examining the complex knot, turning it in his hands, contemplating strategy. For a moment, he considered patience, the careful untangling of each strand. Then, with a decisive swing of his sword, he cut through it in one stroke. The crowd gasped. To Alexander, destiny was not won by hesitation, but by action. The omen was clear. Asia was his to command. The true test of his genius awaited at Issus.
Darius III, the Persian king, had gathered a massive army to stop the Macedonian advance. The numbers were staggering. Perhaps hundreds of thousands of soldiers, cavalrymen, chariots, and elephants lined the plains, a sea of armor and banners stretching to the horizon. But Alexander was undaunted. He surveyed the battlefield, his eyes sharp, mind calculating. The terrain was narrow, hemmed by mountains and the sea, and he would use it to turn Persia's strength into weakness.
When the battle erupted, it was chaos and brilliance intertwined. The Persians surged forward in waves, their war cries shaking the air, their chariots cutting through the ranks like scythes. Alexander, mounted on Bucephalus, led the companion cavalry in a daring maneuver, striking directly at the heart of Darius's forces. The young king's presence was electric, inspiring his men, striking fear into the enemy. In a flash, the Persian center buckled. Darius, terrified, fled in his chariot, leaving his army in disarray. The Macedonian victory was total, and the name of Alexander spread like wildfire across Asia Minor. Every city he encountered after Issus bent before him. Some welcomed him as liberator from Persian rule. Others capitulated at the sight of his army and the memory of Darius's defeat. Each victory was more than military, it was psychological. Alexander understood the minds of men as well as he understood the art of war. Loyalty could be earned, fear could be cultivated, and both could be wielded as weapons more deadly than swords. Amid the conquest, Alexander remained a student of the world. He observed the customs, languages, and religions of the lands he traversed. He treated conquered peoples with surprising generosity, blending Macedonian authority with respect for local traditions. His goal was not merely to conquer, but to unite, to build an empire that could endure. He envisioned cities, roads, and networks of commerce linking east and west, a civilization in his image, not merely a collection of captured lands.
Yet even in triumph, there were signs of the price of ambition. His men grew weary of constant marching and battle. Injuries and exhaustion tested their loyalty. And in the quiet moments, Alexander wrestled with the enormity of his own drive. He was no longer a boy chasing glory, nor merely a king asserting dominion. He was becoming a force of nature, a man whose ambition could consume all, yet whose vision promised a world unlike any before. When the dust settled on the plains of Asia Minor, Alexander had not merely defeated armies. He had transformed the very perception of what a single man could achieve. The empire of Persia, once thought invincible, now lay vulnerable, its heart exposed to the brilliance and daring of a 22-year-old king. And as he gazed toward the east, toward the mountains and rivers that still awaited him, Alexander's resolve hardened. Persia's riches, its cities, and its crown were within reach, and nothing, neither man nor terrain nor fate, would stop him. The world had begun to bend to his will. Alexander of Macedon was no longer a prince, no longer merely a conqueror of cities. He was Lord of Asia, a living force whose name would echo across generations. Each victory carried the weight of destiny, and the story of a boy who became a king was now the story of a man who would become legend.
Chapter 6. Pharaoh of Egypt, 332 BC. The Nile stretched before him like a ribbon of gold under the scorching sun. Alexander rode along its banks, the heat shimmering off the water, his cloak flapping in the wind, eyes fixed on the horizon. Egypt lay before him, a land of ancient kings and gods, pyramids and temples, a civilization steeped in millennia of history. Yet it was a land poised to welcome a conqueror who was unlike any before, a man whose ambition reached beyond borders, who sought not merely to dominate, but to be remembered forever.
When Alexander entered Egypt, the people greeted him as a liberator. Persian garrisons had ruled harshly, and the Egyptians longed for someone who could restore order and dignity. The young king did not disappoint. He moved with calculated respect, visiting the temples of Amun, paying homage to the gods of the land, and allowing the priests to proclaim him Pharaoh, the living embodiment of divine authority. In his mind, the symbolism was not mere ceremony, it was strategy. By embracing their traditions, he could unite the people behind him, making conquest as much about hearts as about armies. In the city of Memphis, he walked among the priests and scribes, listening to their wisdom and learning the intricacies of a culture older than his own. He studied the Nile's flood, the rituals of kingship, and the mysteries of the temples. Alexander understood that power was not only won on the battlefield, it was built through respect, through understanding, and through the perception of inevitability. In Egypt, he became not just a ruler, but a god among men, a king whose authority was sanctioned by the divine.
Yet it was in the city of Alexandria that Alexander's vision truly began to take form. He chose the site himself, on a narrow strip of land between the sea and the Nile Delta, imagining a city that would serve as a beacon of Greek culture, commerce, and military power for generations to come. Under his guidance, architects and engineers laid the foundations, roads were planned, harbors dug, and the promise of a metropolis that could rival any in the world began to take shape. Alexander envisioned a city that would serve not only as a strategic stronghold, but as a symbol, a testament to the unity of East and West, a crown jewel of an empire in the making. Despite the grandeur of statecraft, Alexander's life in Egypt was never free of vigilance. Scouts brought news of Persian forces regrouping, and he prepared for campaigns that would push him even further into unknown lands. But for a brief moment, he allowed himself the luxury of reflection. He walked along the banks of the Nile at dusk, the river reflecting the fiery glow of the setting sun. He thought of his father, Philip, slain before he could see this empire rise. He thought of Aristotle, whose teaching still guided his mind. And he thought of the countless soldiers who had followed him across continents, risking life and limb for a cause they could barely comprehend, the vision of a world united under the will of Alexander. In Egypt, he also encountered omens that would haunt and inspire him for the rest of his life. At the Oracle of Siwa, deep in the desert, he traveled with a small retinue through scorching sands and treacherous paths to reach the temple of Amun. The oracle pronounced him the son of Zeus, confirming what his mother had long whispered and what his own heart had always known. The words struck him not merely as prophecy, but as a challenge. The gods had chosen him, and the mantle of destiny was heavy. The empire he sought to forge was not just political, it was cosmic.
As pharaoh, Alexander combined the precision of a general, the vision of a statesman, and the aura of a god. He was meticulous in administration, decisive in justice, and bold in action. His policies in Egypt stabilized the region, won the loyalty of the people, and cemented his reputation as a ruler who could blend conquest with legitimacy. Every city he entered, every army he commanded, every word he spoke reinforced a simple truth. Alexander was no ordinary man. He was a king whose ambition knew no bounds, whose mind reached beyond the horizon, and whose name would be etched into eternity. Yet even amid triumph, Alexander's gaze never lingered. Persia still lay to the east, and Darius remained a shadow over his ambitions. Egypt was a jewel in his crown, but it was only a stepping stone.
He prepared his forces, replenished supplies, and inspired his men with visions of further conquest. The desert sands whispered promises of glory. The Nile carried tales of kings to come, and Alexander, Pharaoh of Egypt, knew that the greatest battles and the most legendary victories still awaited him. In Egypt, the world began to see him not only as a conqueror, but as a visionary, a ruler capable of blending divine authority with mortal power, strategy with awe, and ambition with inspiration. The foundations of an empire were laid, and the young king's legend grew. Across deserts and rivers, from the tombs of pharaohs to the temples of gods, the story of Alexander spread like wildfire. A man destined to change the course of history, whose shadow would fall over continents and whose name would be etched into eternity.
Chapter 7. The Heart of Persia, 331 BC. The plains of Gaugamela stretched endlessly under a sky burned gold by the rising sun. Alexander stood atop a slight rise, surveying the horizon, where the Persian army sprawled like a living wall. Darius III, the king who had fled at Issus, had amassed forces far greater than anything Alexander had faced before. Cavalry and infantry numbered in the hundreds of thousands, chariots bristling with scythes glinting in the morning light, banners snapping sharply in the wind. The ground itself seemed to quake with the weight of destiny. Alexander's eyes narrowed, tracing the formations of his enemy. He was outnumbered, as he had been at Granicus and Issus. But numbers meant little to a mind that calculated, anticipated, and struck with ruthless precision. The young king rode among his officers, his voice calm, steady, a spark of unshakable resolve in every command. His men, weary from the endless campaign, yet ignited by loyalty and fear of their leader, stood ready to follow him into the jaws of death. They knew that where Alexander led, victory could be wrested from the impossible. As the battle commenced, the earth trembled beneath the charge. Alexander led the companion cavalry in a daring maneuver, piercing the Persian lines at their center. Arrows darkened the sky, the clash of swords rang like thunder, and the screams of men and horses became a symphony of war. Every step, every feint, every calculated risk was guided by Alexander's vision. He was not merely fighting to win, he was shaping history with each decisive movement. Darius, confident in his numbers, watched as the young Macedonian force cut through his ranks like a scythe through wheat. Panic rippled through the Persian army. Alexander, seeing his moment, pressed the advantage. He thundered forward, a living embodiment of courage and fury, directly toward Darius himself. The king fled, as he had before, leaving his empire's heart exposed. The Persian army scattered, shattered not only by sword and strategy, but by the aura of invincibility that clung to Alexander like armor. In the aftermath, Alexander surveyed the battlefield. Thousands lay fallen, but victory had been absolute. Babylon, Susa, and Persepolis, cities of unimaginable wealth, culture, and history, were now within his reach. Each conquest was a step closer to the dream that had fueled him since childhood, an empire stretching from Greece to the edge of India, a world united under one vision. Persepolis, the ceremonial heart of Persia, welcomed him with awe and trepidation. Alexander entered the city not as a conqueror burning in rage, but as a ruler aware of symbolism and power. He allowed his men to loot only sparingly, preserved temples and palaces, and presented himself as both liberator and emperor. The Persian treasures, the palaces adorned with gold, silver, and precious stones, were not merely plunder. They were tools to solidify loyalty, symbols of the power that Alexander now commanded. Yet, even as he claimed Persia's heart, Alexander's mind moved forward. The empire was vast, the territories sprawling, the peoples diverse and often resistant. He knew that true conquest was not measured only by battles won, but by the ability to govern, to integrate, to leave behind systems that would endure beyond his lifetime. Governors were appointed, cities refounded in his name, roads and supply lines established, and a vision of administration as grand as his military genius took shape.
Despite triumph, danger lingered. Darius remained alive, plotting revenge from the east, and distant lands whispered of rebellion. Alexander, though, did not falter. Each night he pored over maps, letters, and reports, planning campaigns, training soldiers, and weaving strategy into a tapestry of inevitability. He was no longer just the boy who tamed Bucephalus, the pupil of Aristotle, or the king who seized Macedonia in blood. He was a man whose ambition could rewrite the world, whose courage inspired men beyond measure, and whose vision could bend continents to his will. The heart of Persia had fallen, yet Alexander's journey had only begun. As he rode across the plains, the wind carrying the scent of conquest and the distant roar of the liberated, he understood something that few rulers ever do. That true greatness was not merely to seize a kingdom, but to make history itself yield to one's will. And Alexander, young, fearless, and inexhaustible, would not rest until the world remembered his name forever.
Chapter 8. The Edge of the World. The mountains rose like jagged teeth against the horizon, snow-capped and unyielding, their peaks hiding secrets no man had dared to conquer. Alexander rode at the head of his army, the Macedonian soldiers trudging through valleys of ice and stone, their breaths visible in the frigid air, their bodies pushed beyond exhaustion. The lands they traversed were no longer the familiar plains of Greece or the rich rivers of Persia. These were the frontiers of the known world, where maps ended and legends began. Every step eastward brought new challenges. Nomadic tribes, hostile and untamed, harried the flanks of his army. Deserts of dust and rock, rivers swollen with spring melt, and mountain passes that seemed impossible to traverse tested every ounce of skill, courage, and patience Alexander possessed. Yet he pressed on, for in his mind the conquest of these lands was as vital as any battle. To stop now would be to betray destiny itself. In the city of Persepolis, Alexander had claimed the heart of Persia, but he had not yet claimed its spirit. As he moved eastward, he sought not only to conquer armies, but to absorb cultures, to understand customs, and to merge the diverse peoples of his growing empire into a single vision. His army carried Persian gold, Greek ideals, and Macedonian discipline across rivers and mountains, and with each step, Alexander's legend grew. Men began to speak of him as more than mortal, a son of gods walking the earth, destined to stretch the borders of civilization to the edge of imagination. The campaign led him into the lands of Bactria and Sogdiana, regions fierce and proud, where fortified cities clung to hills like nests of eagles. Here, the battles became grueling, not merely of strength, but of endurance and wit. Alexander adapted, employing tactics suited to the terrain, forming alliances with some tribes while crushing others without hesitation. His leadership was unshakable. Where others would falter in exhaustion, he rode at the front, a constant presence, a symbol of courage that inspired his soldiers to unimaginable feats.
It was during these campaigns that Alexander faced challenges unlike any before. In Sogdiana, local chieftains waged guerrilla warfare,
striking and disappearing into the mountains. Entire nights were spent defending positions against sudden attacks, entire days spent rebuilding supply lines torn by the terrain and by treachery. Yet Alexander's genius shone in adversity. He led from the front, personally directing attacks, inspiring fear in enemies and loyalty in his men. Villages that had resisted Macedonian rule now fell, not simply because of force, but because they recognized in him a force that seemed unstoppable, a mind that calculated every possibility, a heart that refused to yield. Amid the endless campaigns, Alexander forged bonds that would define his life and legend. His closest companion, Hephaestion, shared the burden of command, and their friendship became a cornerstone of his confidence. Trusted generals carried out his vision with precision, while his army, hardened and loyal, began to believe that the impossible was possible. Every mountain crossed, every fortress taken, every river forded was a testament to their unity and his leadership. But even in victory, the horizon always beckoned further east. Tales of vast armies and kingdoms richer and stranger than Persia reached his ears. India, with its exotic lands, towering rivers, and immense wealth, loomed as the final frontier. Alexander, undeterred by distance or danger, saw in these lands not merely conquest, but the opportunity to prove that no force could withstand his ambition. He dreamed of uniting worlds, of blending cultures, of building a civilization that would outlast kings and empires alike.
In these distant lands, Alexander's men began to whisper legends, stories of a king who rode without fear, who tamed wild horses, who outwitted armies, and who crossed deserts and mountains that were thought impassable. His presence became myth, his ambition became prophecy. And as he gazed eastward, the edge of the known world stretched before him, vast, dangerous, and irresistible. At the Indus River, Alexander paused to reflect. The waters flowed wide and powerful, a boundary as daunting as any mountain or army he had faced. Beyond lay lands of unknown peoples, unknown customs, unknown dangers. Yet in his heart there was no hesitation. The river was not a limit, it was a gateway to glory, to immortality, and to the creation of an empire that would stretch from the shores of Greece to the distant plains of India. As his army prepared to ford the river, Alexander stood atop a hill, looking eastward, the sun casting long shadows across the plains. He was no longer the boy of Pella, nor the pupil of Aristotle, nor even the young king who had seized the throne in blood. He was a conqueror of worlds, a master of men and terrain, a living legend whose ambition and vision knew no bounds. The edge of the world was not the end, it was the beginning of a new chapter, a new horizon, and the next test of his indomitable will.
Chapter 9, Return of the Conqueror, 327 to 325 BC. The Ganges shimmered like molten silver under the midday sun as Alexander's army, exhausted yet unbroken, trudged along its banks. After years of relentless conquest, from the plains of Asia Minor to the mountains of Bactria and the deserts of Egypt, the Macedonian soldiers had reached the edge of the known world. Yet even here, in lands alien and formidable, Alexander's vision drove him forward. India was a land of riches, rivers, and armies unlike any he had faced. Every step was a test of endurance, courage, and strategy, and he faced it with the unyielding resolve that had carried him across continents. The Battle of the Hydaspes was unlike any before. King Porus, commanding a vast army that included towering war elephants, awaited the Macedonians on the opposite bank. The ground shook under the march of beasts, their trumpets a thunderous roar, their riders clad in gleaming armor. Alexander surveyed the battlefield with his mind racing through every possible tactic. The river, swollen from seasonal rains, could have been an obstacle. Instead, he turned it into an advantage. Using a surprise crossing, he flanked Porus's forces, his cavalry cutting through the enemy lines with precision, his infantry pressing relentlessly. The elephants charged, trumpeting fury and terror, yet the Macedonians held formation, their discipline unshakable under Alexander's command. In the chaos, Alexander led from the front, his presence a beacon of courage. Arrows struck around him, men fell on both sides, and the earth itself seemed to tremble beneath the clash. Yet the Macedonian strategy prevailed. Porus was eventually captured, and Alexander, recognizing his valor, treated him with respect, reinstating him as ruler under Macedonian suzerainty. It was a lesson in leadership. Conquest was not merely about destruction, but about forging loyalty and order from chaos. The young king, who had crossed oceans and mountains, who had toppled kings and empires, now demonstrated that wisdom was as powerful as the sword.
But even in triumph, fatigue and unrest simmered within the ranks. The soldiers, far from home for years, weary from endless campaigns, demanded return. Mutiny whispered along the lines, warning that even the most loyal hearts could break under the weight of ambition. Alexander, ever perceptive, understood the delicate balance between inspiration and exhaustion. He calmed the murmurs with speeches of glory, by granting concessions and by demonstrating his willingness to share in the burdens of the march. His presence alone, fearless and tireless, reminded them why they had followed him across the world. The journey back was no less arduous. Monsoon rains swelled rivers, deserts tested endurance, and the soldiers struggled with disease, hunger, and homesickness. Yet Alexander pressed forward, for he understood that an empire is not conquered merely by battle, but by the ability to endure, organize, and inspire even in the face of insurmountable adversity. Along the way, he continued his practice of blending cultures, adopting local customs, marrying strategically, and incorporating foreign soldiers into his army. He was creating not just a military force, but a civilization that reflected the unity of his conquests. By the time they returned to Babylon, the heart of the empire he had claimed from Persia, Alexander had transformed not only his army, but himself. He was no longer simply a king or a conqueror. He was a unifier, a statesman, and a visionary whose influence reached far beyond the battlefield. Cities had been founded, roads constructed, and trade networks established. The Macedonian army, though exhausted, had achieved what many thought impossible: the forging of an empire that spanned continents. Yet even in victory, Alexander's mind remained restless. He dreamed of further conquest, of exploring lands beyond the Ganges, of pushing boundaries that even the gods might not have imagined. But his soldiers, weary and longing for home, drew the limits of their endurance. Alexander realized that even the greatest ambition must contend with human limits. The return from India marked a turning point. The transition from relentless expansion to consolidation, from legendary battles to governance, from the thrill of conquest to the responsibility of empire.
In the twilight of the journey, Alexander stood atop the walls of a city in Babylon, gazing eastward toward lands he had not yet conquered. The sun set behind distant mountains, casting long shadows over rivers and plains, and in that moment he understood both the magnitude of his achievements and the inexhaustible drive that still burned within him. He was Alexander the Great, conqueror of the known world, master of men and empires, and yet even now he hungered for more glory, more legacy, more eternity. The world had bent to his will, kingdoms had fallen, and legends had been forged. But Alexander knew that history was not written by those who rest, it was written by those who dare, those who push beyond the edge of the world, and those who refuse to yield to fate.
Chapter 10. The Fall and the Immortality, 323 BC. Babylon, the jewel of Alexander's empire, shimmered under the heat of the Mesopotamian sun. The city that had welcomed him years earlier, where he had dreamed of uniting East and West, now bore witness to the twilight of a life that had reshaped the world. Alexander, once the unstoppable force who had tamed continents and armies alike, walked the streets with a mind both brilliant and burdened. He was a king who had conquered empires, yet he now faced an enemy beyond strategy or courage, mortality itself. The years of relentless campaigns had taken their toll. His body, though hardened by battles from the Granicus to the Ganges, was weary, racked by fever, exhaustion, and injuries sustained across continents. His mind, still sharp and unyielding, wrestled with visions of the empire he had forged, vast, glorious, yet fragile. Even as his generals and companions worked to maintain control over the lands he had claimed, Alexander contemplated the legacy of a life that had burned brighter than any before it. Whispers filled the palaces of Babylon. Some spoke of poison, others of disease, but the truth was simpler and crueler. Alexander's body could no longer withstand the demands of the world he had conquered. In his final days, he summoned his closest companions, generals who had followed him across deserts and rivers, mountains and plains. He spoke not only of strategy and conquest, but of the empire itself, a vision of unity and greatness that transcended his own life. His words were heavy with the weight of knowledge and the sorrow of farewell.
Yet even in decline, Alexander's mind remained a force of inspiration. He spoke of cities yet to be built, of cultures yet to be reconciled, of rivers yet to be crossed. He dreamed aloud of an empire that would endure, a civilization that would outlive kings and conquerors alike. His generals listened, awed not only by his intellect, but by the unyielding spirit that had carried him from the halls of Pella to the edge of the world. When the end came, it was quiet, almost inconceivable after a life defined by thunder and fire. Alexander died in his bed, surrounded by the spoils of empires, the scrolls of wisdom he had collected, and the few loyal companions who had shared every danger and triumph. Yet even in death, his presence seemed to linger. The world had known him not merely as a man, but as a force that had rewritten the boundaries of possibility. The empire he left behind was vast but fragile, stretching from the shores of Greece to the rivers of India. His generals, once companions, became rulers of fragments, warring for dominance in a world he had unified only through his singular will. Yet even as divisions arose, his name, legend, and vision endured. Cities he had founded thrived for centuries, roads he had ordered connected civilizations, and the cultural fusion he inspired reshaped the known world. Alexander's death did not mark the end of his influence. It was merely the beginning of his immortality. Stories of his courage, brilliance, and ambition spread across lands and generations. Poets wrote of his battles, historians chronicled his campaigns, and rulers studied his strategies. The young prince of Pella had become a king, a conqueror, a visionary, and ultimately a symbol that greatness was not limited to mortals. Even now, centuries later, Alexander's shadow stretches across the world. The horse he rode, the cities he founded, the battles he commanded, they live in memory, in legend, in the very fabric of history. He had glimpsed the edge of the world and gone beyond it. He had seized kingdoms, tamed empires, and challenged the limits of human ambition. And though he fell, his story achieved what he had always sought: immortality. From the marble halls of Pella to the deserts of Egypt, the mountains of Bactria, and the rivers of India, Alexander's life was a testament to vision, courage, and the relentless pursuit of destiny. He was not merely a man of his time. He was the embodiment of ambition unchained, a force that reshaped continents and inspired humanity to believe that the impossible could be conquered. His flame burned bright, his legacy endured, and the world would never forget the name, Alexander the Great.